everyone, and welcome to CMSMC's Tools of the Trade. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, or perhaps afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Mary Kate Smolinski, and I am the Operations Director for CMSMC. And for those of you who don't know, the Coalition Master Scholars on Material Culture, or CMSMC, is a platform born online dedicated to helping emerging and established master scholars, providing a space to publish their work and contribute to the expanding field of material culture. CMSMC is a new organization and was created after we ourselves experienced difficulties facing those with master's degrees in fields relating to material culture, especially during the pandemic. Funding, jobs, and other opportunities were and are still scarce. Our platform is not associated with a university and is run by fellow master scholars, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit. Our online publication is similar to an undergraduate review, and we aim to fill a gap for those earning or possessing a master's degree. These scholars are often competing with doctoral students or established academics for publication in other journals. And in the 2 years that our site has been live, we have published over 70 articles with more in the works, had almost 30,000 unique readers on our website, and have hosted 3 previous symposiums. If you're wondering about ways to get involved or support CMSMC, there are several opportunities. You can make a tax-deductible donation via DonorBox. We also have a store on our website where we're currently selling CMSMC apparel, including our original History Should Make You Uncomfortable merchandise, inspired by our inaugural symposium. We are completely funded by your support, and any financial contribution is greatly appreciated and helps support our mission. We also encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on future symposiums and other professional development and networking events, like our upcoming Material Culture Career Path event with Marcus Harshaw on January 17th. All of this information can be found on our website, and we encourage you to reach out to collaborate. We'll also be sharing these links in our chat if you are interested. For our fall 2022 symposium, Tools of the Trade, we wanted to explore what we use to delve deeper into the analysis of material culture and how those tools are intrinsic pieces of material and immaterial culture themselves. We posited questions such as, how do the mechanisms we use to teach, uncover, and study material culture affect the work that we do? How do our educational backgrounds, theoretical approaches, and industry approaches influence the way we interpret objects? How do our tools act as a catalyst for our work of uncovering the past? We wanted to bring together a group of scholars who explored these questions in a wide variety of topics. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce our panelists. Colton Klein will start off the morning with his presentation titled Under Ultraviolet, Questions of Materiality in Grant Wood's Portrait of Nan. This centers on the case study of Portrait of Nan, 1931, and how auction houses such as Sotheby's contribute to material culture research through condition assessments and UV light analysis. These assessments can reveal information about retouching and the original materials, making them a key aspect in historical investigation. Colton's presentation will also discuss how these assessments can pose ethical and legal questions in terms of item authenticity, conditions of sale, and exhibition practices. He is a recent graduate of the MA in Art History program at Columbia University, where he focused on American visual culture for the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries, with interest in materiality, eco-criticism, and affect theory. Next, we have Carla Ayukawa. Her presentation, Hidden in Plain Sight, Non-Sighted Ways Towards Richer Object Examinations, focuses on ocular-centric bias in research. Carla worked with individuals with congenital and early onset blindness to interpret objects from a non-ocular-centered narrative. This led to richer object narratives, sparking the discussion of how the different senses offer a unique way of analyzing objects than simply relying on ocular-centric based research, and how her findings could impact the management of cultural heritage. She holds a master's degree in design from Carleton University, Ottawa, and currently focuses her work on accessibility and inclusive media. We will also be hearing from Nick Purgett, presenting on Paper Red Enough to Set His Face Aglow, Materiality, and the Genji Mogatari Amaki. Nick is in the History of Art PhD program at the University of Pennsylvania with a focus on Japanese art. His research examines the illustrated hand scrolls of the Tales of Genji. Created in the 12th century, these hand scrolls are the oldest surviving pictorial example of the piece. Instead of focusing on the pictorial world depicted in the hand scrolls, Nick's presentation dives into the significance of the materials used to create the hand scrolls and what said materials can tell us about the society in which the piece was created. Then we have Alejandra Velasquez's presentation, Rebodying Stereotypes, Contemporary Indigenous Artists and the Body. Alejandra has an MA in Art History from the George Washington University. Her presentation focuses on the work of artist James Luna, a performance artist and photographer, and Wendy Redstar, a multimedia artist. Alejandra's analysis of the two artists discusses the ways in which they tackle the subject of Indigenous stereotypes. The tool in question is the artist's bodies, which they use in their art as a means to take control of the narrative and portray their own cultural identity by reframing the stereotypes. Olashola Olajobi will share his presentation, Rethinking Museums and Waste and Conserving Material Culture through the Waste Museum Concept. He is a conceptual artist and independent art history scholar. Olashola's presentation discusses Nigeria's Waste Museum, a showcase center open to the public on February 16th this year as part of the country's waste management education. The Waste Museum works to collect, preserve, and showcase artworks made from waste or upcycled materials, such as dishware, tiles, bottle covers, and soles of shoes. Today, we'll hear about the mission, vision, and ideology behind the museum in relation to material culture preservation tools, as well as the museum's place in 21st century Africa, where museums are seen as centers for the collection of idols, cultural attires, and religious effigies. To end our panel, we will hear from our keynote speaker, Dory Miller, who will be further introduced later on. She will share a keynote address on the tools of material culture from a maker's perspective. Finally, before we continue, I would like to thank our symposium committee, Perry Buke, Christine Staton, Reb Zhu, Molly Radford, Sarah Heinzlich, and Mary Manfredi, without whom this symposium would not have been possible in the slightest. Now, without further ado, here is Colton Klein.
I'll just jump into my presentation. It's pretty much agreed that understanding the world really needs a multisensory experience. So touch supplements object details that are not always accessible by sight. Sound, taste, and temperature perception all play a role in creating, life experiences and mental models. However, the visual sense dominates, and this visual sense has led to an ocular-centric understanding of the world and affects our theoretical approaches and research methodologies. So hi, my name is Carla Ayukawa, and I'm here to talk about a tool of the trade that aims to transform these ocular-centric understandings of the world. And I'll talk about a non-sighted way that might change how object narratives are collected and offer a new point of entry to uncovering and studying material culture. It's a tool that uses interdisciplinary research practices that draw from material culture studies, participatory design, and qualitative analysis research methods. I'm an industrial designer, instructor at Carleton University School of Industrial Design, a Master of Design, and I have a graduate diploma in curatorial studies. The following institutions who supported the study are here, and they include Ingenium, Canada's Museum of Science and Technology, the Canadian Council of the Blind, the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and Carleton University. And I'll be visually describing the slides of my presentation. I'll start by setting the stage about the visual bias in material culture study. So here we are today on Zoom, using this really highly visual platform and looking at an image on the slide. This image shows a page from a very old book. It's an etching of a private museum in 1677. And it depicts a large room with objects openly displayed on the walls and shelves. And there are two gentlemen in this room, and one is holding a vase, and the other one is gesturing towards the shelves. So as is suggested in this historical image, object collections and their studies were originally multisensory. Private collections such as these allowed hosts and guests to openly examine objects, up close and personal. However, about 200 years ago, sensory bias in favor of sight emerged and changed this type of access, and along with it, the trajectory of Western material culture study. And this led to changes in research and knowledge sharing practice, which still impacts us today. So this slide shows an image of Charles Darwin and with the beaks of 4 birds. And on the top left, there is an image of the Elgin Marbles at the British Museum, which is behind a barrier. And on the top left is an image of a group of adults in a museum settings. And these adults are dressed in clothes that identify them as being part of the social upper class in the 1900s. So how did we get from a multi-sensory access in object examination to today's visual bias? So to start, museums transformed from private to public collections around the time of the French Revolution. Other museums began opening their doors to the public at this time or later. And with this kind of democratization, however, public access became considered a liability to the owners, and multisensory access was no longer possible, and touching was restricted. A proper and civilized way of seeing was promoted by the museum. So these changes impacted our ways of knowing in various areas. So starting with the physical impacts of access. So a loss of multisensory access in research led to this visual bias in knowledge creation. So for example, scientific concepts such as those used in biology or chemistry requires the student to have a visual experience. And as a result, few individuals with low vision pursue a scientific career since scientific concepts and theories, such as the theory of evolution, are based on ocular-centric teaching. Another way is the institutional policies about touch impact access. So in this case, some museum policies prioritize object protection over object activation. And this tension between the benefits of handling and the potential for damage to the objects can lead to conservation policies that privilege experts. And this privilege can be, what defines the identity of a museum and the museum professionals. And to some, this identity must be protected. Another area are the social impacts of visual bias, and they're the inclusive access to objects. So, in the past, access has been restricted to elites, which today has resulted in a lack of diversity in the narrative. But source communities are slowly regaining access, and the value of other points of view and experiences are being recognized by researchers. But non-ocular centric points of view and research are extremely rare. So how can we minimize visual privilege, ocular-centric practices, and bias? I propose that one way could be to activate non-sighted touching as a tool for object examination and interpretation. So shown on this slide is a framework for a research methodology that responds to ocular-centric practices and bias. And this methodology was designed with an interdisciplinary framework, drawing on research techniques from material culture studies, sensory museology, and participatory design research using cultural probes. On the left of the slide is the starting point that uses John Sclereth's system of scaffolded questions to progressively describe, understand, and interpret objects, and Bill Gaver's use of cultural probes to provoke responses that reflect participant cultural perspectives and life experiences. And these were integrated into object examination sessions, such as semi-structured focus group interviews, and it used museum-type objects. And the data from the session led to a thematic analysis from which emerged novel object narratives. But a key aspect here shown in this research methodology were participants with congenital and early onset blindness. First, I'll talk about the choice of objects for examination. So in this study, 2 objects were used to explore if the non-visual object examination could generate novel object interpretation. And so the objects shown, the objects I used were the Juicy Salif by Alessi and the Contempora telephone by the Northern Electric Company, which are both shown here on the slide. And the criteria for selecting the 2 objects included the following. So they needed to be similar to objects found in museum collections. They needed to have a dominant ocular-centric narrative, and they also needed to be robust for handling and shipping. So the Juicy Salif is part of many museum collections, including the MoMA and the Design Museum. And shown here on the slide is when it was part of an exhibition at the Vitra Design Museum, right here. And the Contemporary Telephone is part of a museum collection in Canada and Great Britain. And shown here is when it was on display at the DX Museum in Toronto. It's kind of hard to see in this photo. It's right here. It's white. So about the participants, because I wanted to examine non-visual mental models of the world, I needed to eliminate the variable of ocular-centric bias. So my research participants were adults with congenital and early onset blindness. So this group has life experiences that are sometimes different than ours as a result of their non-sighted ways. And they also have a heightened tactile acuity and awareness. So this slide shows screen captures from the participants examining the objects. And these screen captured images are from video recordings during the object examinations, which were conducted remotely on Zoom. Conducting the research over Zoom had its challenges and benefits. One of the benefits was that it allowed for a greater pool of participants. The challenge was creating a remote research kit that blind participants could use independently. The three images on the bottom of the slide show research kits that were couriered to the participants for the object research sessions. The kits included the objects, their consent forms and nitrile gloves, and the contents of the boxes were identified with grid. So in the sessions, participants were prompted for their sensory descriptions, their first impressions, and what they considered to be the most interesting thing about the object. They were also prompted with questions to explore its function, how its form factors might trigger a life memory, and if there was something they could compare it to. Okay, this slide shows, sorry, it's my dog, two infographics that illustrate thematic analysis and how the in vivo coding method contributed to the object narrative. And the Zoom recordings were transcribed verbatim. Relevant comments and insights were identified and coded using the in vivo coding method. And this method helped to retain the participants' cultural perspectives and language, which was crucial to defining insights and to minimize misinterpretation by my own ocular-centric bias. And the in vivo coding method identified inclusive codes that refer to non-sighted mental models or life experiences. And the codes were sorted into categories and later further distilled into themes. And from those themes, an exhibition topic or an object narrative was formulated. For example, if you look at the graphic on the right here, we see how transcribed text from object examination of the contemporary telephone contributed to an object narrative of muscle memory. So the transcribed quote showed on the slide reads, when I memorize any set of numbers, let's say I'm memorizing my bank card number or my MasterCard number, my mnemonic is to imagine the keyboard of a telephone, of a push button phone, and my mind learned to memorize numbers that way. So the in vivo code for this quote is to imagine the keyboard of a telephone or a push button phone. And this was identified as an insight and later sorted into a category of training, and together with other categories was integrated into an object narrative of muscle memory. So this infographic illustrates how using this research method and non-sighted ways can lead to a novel object interpretation of the contemporary telephone. So what were the overall findings from the object research session? Well, in my study, the three non-ocular-centric ocular-centric object narratives emerged from the thematic analysis, which were different than the object's dominant narratives. So on this slide, I'm going to show two examples and compare them with their dominant narratives. So for the Juicy Salif, here. It's an object whose dominant narrative commonly associates it with the discipline of industrial design and the rise of visual culture in the 1980s. However, with using this interdisciplinary framework and qualitative thematic analysis and the participants' distinctive non-visual life experiences and insights, the Juicy Salif was reinterpreted as an embodiment of a Victorian era aesthetic. And this emerged from the in vivo categories such as old, antique, craftsmanship, tradition, and social class. And the participants associated the juicer as having a Victorian era aesthetic, which is a new interpretation of the object. And the images shown here is of various cast hand tools from that area to show how the juicer kind of shares this similar design aesthetic. The contemporary telephone is an object whose dominant narrative is commonly linked to the Canadian post-war modern design and that era's use of plastic, color, and Neoplatonic geometry of the international style. And so using this interdisciplinary framework, the object examination triggered insights about deep memory, action, muscle movement, training, and spatial memory. And today, the object can be linked to a new narrative, and that is to muscle memory. And so on this slide, you can see the object, complementary to the notion of muscle memory. It's a push-button telephone with, a non-traditional layout of numbers. So these novel interpretations of the object hopefully demonstrate how leveraging non-sighted ways can lead to outcomes that are different than those dominated by ocular-centric practices and bias. And so in essence, the interpretations were always present, but just invisible to those who examine them only with their eyes and their bias. And these new interpretations became visible through non-sighted ways. So hopefully this study points to a possibility of a contribution to material culture studies whereby richer and more diverse narratives may emerge from data from people's voices. And the findings demonstrate the value of including people with congenital and early onset blindness to expand multisensory practices in object examination. So thank you for listening and looking.
All right. Thank you so much, Carla, for that really fascinating presentation. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Purgett. I'm a PhD student in the Department of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, I'll be presenting my paper entitled "On Paper Red Enough to Set His Face Aglow, Materiality in the Genji Monogatari." The tale of Genji is filled with